Is a man defined by the car he drives? Or the secret cargo that keeps the world's economy turning? He thought he could humiliate us in public, until the heavy-duty prototypes in our truck proved who really held the power. We endured the insults, knowing our hidden payload was worth more than his entire career. And by the time this story is over, you're going to understand something about yourself too, something about the quiet weight you carry that other people will never see, and why that weight matters more than anything that shines under a streetlight. Let me take you back further than the parking lot, further even than that morning, because you need to understand who I was before any of this happened, so you understand exactly what got taken from me, and exactly what I took back. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I've been driving trucks since I was 22 years old, which means by the time all of this happened, I'd logged something close to 2 million miles. 2 million miles of interstate, mountain pass, desert heat, ice storms in places you wouldn't believe ice could form. I started out hauling produce lettuce, mostly up from the valley, the kind of route where if you're an hour late, an entire truckload rots in the heat and a farmer loses his whole season over your mistake. I learned discipline on those routes before I learned almost anything else in my adult life. I learned that nobody was going to forgive you for being tired, or being distracted, or having a bad day. The lettuce didn't care about your bad day. The farmer waiting at the other end didn't care either. Then I moved into general freight, and after almost a decade of clean safety records and a reputation nobody in this industry could argue with, I got recruited into something most drivers never even hear about in their whole careers: specialized cargo transport. The kind of freight that doesn't get advertised, doesn't get logos, doesn't get talked about at truck stops. Medical isotopes, aerospace components, prototype equipment worth more than most people's houses, moving quietly across the country in trucks that look, on the outside, like absolutely nothing at all. That's the part nobody understands about this work unless they've lived inside it. The less impressive your truck looks, the better you're actually doing your job. You don't want a shiny corporate logo plastered across the side when you're hauling something that a certain kind of person would very much like to steal or track or intercept. You want a truck that gets ignored. A truck that blends into the background at a gas station, that a bored teenager working the counter doesn't even glance at twice. A truck that a man in a $500 jacket looks at and feels nothing but contempt for, because contempt means he stopped paying attention, and a driver like me needs him to stop paying attention. His contempt was never an insult to me. It was, in a strange way, proof that I was doing my job correctly. Before I tell you about that morning, I need to tell you about the years that led up to it, because Marcus didn't arrive at that gas station as a blank page. He arrived carrying 7 years of quiet erosion, and I only understood how deep it went once it was almost too late to fix. His mother and I split up when he was 9 years old. I won't spend long on this because it isn't really her story to tell through my mouth, but I'll say this much: she came from a family that measured a man by his business card, by the size of his office window, by whether his name appeared in a certain kind of magazine. She married me young, before either of us really understood what 26 years on the road does to a marriage. The absences wore on her long before they wore on me because I was out there living it, and she was home alone doing the parts of parenting that don't show up on anyone's highlight reel. The school pickups, the fevers at 2 in the morning, the birthday parties where the other fathers were there and I wasn't. I don't blame her for leaving. I blame myself for not finding a way to make her feel like the life we'd built together was enough. But I do blame her, and I'll say this plainly, for what she did after she left. She never once in 7 years told our son that his father's absence meant his father's love. Instead, slowly, in small comments dropped over years, she let him believe his father's absence meant his father's failure. By the time Marcus turned 15, he had started flinching whenever the subject of my job came up in front of his friends. By 16, he'd stopped inviting people over to the house entirely, because the truck sat in our driveway looking more beat up every year. Dents from gravel kicked up on back roads, a cracked side mirror I never got around to fixing because there was always a paying run before there was time for repairs, paint faded down to a dull, sun-bleached version of whatever color it used to be. He didn't see 2 million safe miles when he looked at that truck. He didn't see federal clearances or specialized certifications or 2.5 decades without a single major incident. He saw what any 16-year-old surrounded by classmates in luxury SUVs sees. He saw evidence. I should have told him the truth earlier. I understand that now, with the particular clarity that only comes after you've almost lost something. But there's a specific kind of pride that grows out of doing dangerous, invisible work, The kind of pride that doesn't need an audience to feel real. And some part of me wanted my son to be proud of me for reasons that had nothing to do with the price tag riding behind us on any given day. I wanted him to respect the driving itself, the decades of skill, the trust that federal agencies and private research labs placed in my hands sight unseen, because my record spoke where I couldn't. I wanted him to understand that a man's worth isn't measured by what he's carrying, but by whether the world has learned it can trust him to carry it at all. That is a very difficult lesson to teach a 17-year-old who mostly just wants to stop being embarrassed in the school parking lot. There's one memory from that stretch of years I still think about often. It was a Tuesday evening, maybe 8 months before the parking lot, and Marcus came home from school unusually quiet, dropped his backpack by the door and didn't say a word through dinner. I found out 3 days later, from a teacher at a parent conference, what had actually happened. A group project had been assigned where each student was supposed to describe their parent's profession to the class. Marcus had told his group quietly that his father was in transportation, and one of the boys, a kid whose father owned a chain of car dealerships, had laughed and said in front of the whole group, "So he's basically an Uber driver for boxes." The whole table laughed. Marcus never corrected him. He just sat there and let it happen the same way he would sit there and let Gary Holloway happen 8 months later. Because by then he'd already learned that defending his father out loud only ever seemed to make things worse. I didn't know about that classroom moment until after everything with Gary Holloway had already happened. But once I did know, it helped me understand something crucial. The parking lot wasn't the wound. It was just the place where an old wound finally tore open in front of me, where I could finally see it. So that morning, the actual morning this story turns on, started like 100 other mornings before it, except for one difference that mattered more than I understood at the time. 4 a.m., dark still sitting heavy and complete over the yard. The smell of coffee and diesel mixing together, the way it always does before a long haul. Marcus had asked 3 days earlier if he could come with me on this run, and I remember being surprised, because he hadn't voluntarily ridden along in almost 2 years. I only found out the real reason later from a conversation I overheard between him and his mother on the phone, that stuck with me the way certain overheard sentences do. She had told him, apparently in the middle of some unrelated argument about his grades, that some men just never grow past where they started, and I don't want that for you. Marcus never repeated the whole conversation to me directly. I only know he showed up at the truck at 4 in the morning 3 days later, wanting I think some kind of proof that his father's life meant something real, or proof, if he was being honest with himself, that it didn't. We loaded the trailer under sodium lights at a secure logistics facility 2 hours outside the city, a process that took almost 2 full hours by itself, because you do not load cargo like this the way you load a pallet of canned goods off a forklift in 10 minutes. 4 cryogenic containment units, each one holding prototype components for a next-generation particle detection system being developed under a joint university and federal research initiative. I'm going to keep the technical specifics vague the way I always have to by law, but I'll tell you this much. Each unit had to be maintained at a precise, unwavering internal temperature throughout the entire transport window, monitored continuously by sensors wired directly into a satellite tracking system, and secured with a combination locking mechanism that 3 separate federal agencies had personally signed off on before I was ever cleared to touch it. I had spent 4 full months getting certified for this specific class of transport, on top of 26 years of accumulated driving experience, just to be trusted with this single run. Marcus watched the loading process from the edge of the lot, arms crossed against the early morning chill, and I could see him doing math in his head, trying to understand why 4 crates wrapped in reflective thermal tarps needed this many men in official jackets checking clipboards, this many signatures, this much visible tension from a loading crew that clearly understood the stakes even if my son didn't. But I couldn't explain it to him. The non-disclosure agreement I'd signed months earlier was specific down to individual sentences. No discussion of cargo contents, cargo value, or destination details with anyone outside cleared personnel, family included, under any circumstances, with financial and legal consequences attached that I had no interest in testing. So I just told him what I always told him on runs like this. It's precious cargo, and we're the ones trusted to move it. That's all you need to know right now, and I need you to trust me on that. He nodded like he believed me, but I could see the doubt sitting behind his eyes even then, doubt that had been planted by his mother, watered by every kid at school with a nicer car in the parking lot, and about to be poured full of gasoline by a man named Gary Holloway before the sun even set that day. We stopped for a real breakfast about 90 minutes into the drive, at a small roadside diner I'd been going to for almost 15 years, run by a woman named Coretta who knew my order before I sat down. I want to tell you about this stop specifically because it matters for what comes later, and because it's the last easy, uncomplicated hour Marcus and I would have together before everything changed. Coretta came out from behind the counter, wiped her hands on her apron and said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, "Well, look who finally brought his boy along. Last time I saw you, you were this tall." Holding her hand somewhere around waist height, and Marcus actually laughed, a real laugh, the first one I'd heard from him in weeks. She asked him what he wanted to do with his life, the way older women at diners always ask teenage boys that question like they have all the time in the world for an answer, and Marcus, a little embarrassed, said he wasn't sure yet. Coretta just nodded and said something I've never forgotten. "That's all right, baby. Your daddy didn't know either at your age. Man figures out who he is by doing the work, not by deciding it ahead of time in his head." I watched Marcus turn that sentence over quietly while he ate his eggs, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought maybe this trip really was going to fix something between us before we even reached our destination. Then we stopped for coffee at that gas station plaza off the interstate, and Gary Holloway was standing there next to his Tesla, and everything Coretta's sentence had started to repair got torn open again in about 90 seconds. I want to describe him honestly because it matters for what comes later. Gary Holloway was maybe 50 years old, silver-haired in that expensive, deliberately maintained way that costs more per month than most people's car payments, wearing a quarter-zip pullover under a blazer that had clearly never once touched an hour of manual labor. He had that particular energy certain wealthy men develop over decades, not real confidence, but the performance of confidence, the kind that requires an audience to actually function, the kind that goes quiet and uncertain the second nobody's watching. When my truck pulled in beside his charging station, dust streaked from 2 hours of backroad driving, one headlight slightly dimmer than the other from a wiring issue I hadn't gotten around to fixing yet, I watched his entire posture change. He straightened. He smiled, the particular smile of a man about to enjoy himself at someone else's expense, the way some men smile right before they say something cruel and call it a joke. He said something first about the noise, some comment about how trucks like mine shouldn't be allowed to stink up a nice facility like this one. I ignored it, the way I've learned to ignore 1,000 comments just like it over 26 years of parking lots and truck stops and gas stations. Marcus, though, I could feel him tense up beside me immediately. He wasn't used to hearing strangers talk about us that way out loud in public with an audience. I was. We went inside, got our coffee, used the restroom, and I genuinely thought that was the end of it. But when we came back outside, Gary was still there, and now he had an audience, 2 business associates carrying folders, clearly headed to whatever event he had scheduled downtown that evening, and a young woman filming something on her phone, presumably content for that same event later. And that's when Gary Holloway decided my truck, and my 17-year-old son standing beside it, made for good material. He said it loud. Loud enough that the woman with the phone turned her camera toward us without asking anyone's permission first. "Your son will never amount to anything, riding around in a rust bucket like this. Kid, you better start thinking about a real future because this," and here he gestured at my truck with real theatrical disdain, the exact gesture you'd use pointing at roadkill on the highway shoulder. "This is what happens when a man doesn't have the brains to do better with his life." I felt Marcus go rigid beside me. Not angry. Worse than angry. Ashamed. His shoulders folded inward, the exact posture I'd watched him fold into 100 times over the past 2 years whenever the subject of his father's job came up anywhere near his classmates. I've hauled steel beams that weighed less than the silence that sat between us in that parking lot in the next 10 seconds. Every instinct in me wanted to answer him. I wanted to walk over and remind Gary Holloway that his glass tower downtown, his marble lobby, his little kingdom of overpriced condominiums, didn't get built without men exactly like me. Not one steel beam, not one HVAC compressor, not one elevator motor made it into that building without a truck on a highway somewhere and a driver who knew how to keep 40,000 pounds upright through black ice, blown tires, and 18-hour shifts that would break most men inside a single week. I wanted to tell him that the entire economy he thought he was standing comfortably on top of was actually being carried, quite literally, on the backs of people he had never once bothered to learn the names of. But I didn't say any of it. because saying it would have meant explaining what was actually secured behind me on that trailer, and that was information Gary Holloway had absolutely no business having. So I let him laugh. I let him have his moment because I've learned something over 26 years on these roads that men like Gary never seem to learn in their entire lives. The loudest man in any room is almost always the one who understands the least about what's actually inside that room with him. But Marcus didn't know that yet. All Marcus saw, standing in that parking lot, was his father getting mocked in public by a man in an expensive jacket, and offering absolutely nothing back. No defense. No dignity reclaimed. Just silence and a slow walk back toward the truck. I watched something crack behind his eyes in that exact moment, and it remains to this day one of the worst feelings I have carried as a father, watching your own child begin to believe the world's verdict on you, and being completely powerless in that specific moment to correct it. We didn't speak again until we were back on the highway, tires humming against wet asphalt as the first edges of that storm system started rolling in off the coast. And then Marcus asked me the question that still keeps me up some nights. Quiet. Not accusing. Just tired, in a way no 17-year-old should sound. Dad. Is he right? Are we ever going to be more than this? I didn't answer him right away. Partly because the honest answer was buried under federal non-disclosure clauses thick as a phone book. Partly because I needed a few seconds to get my own voice under control before I trusted myself to speak. So I just said, "Buckle up," and watched him turn back toward the window, and I made a promise to myself in that silence that I intend to keep for the rest of my life. That boy was never going to doubt his father's worth again after that night, whatever it took, whatever rules I had to quietly bend to make it happen. What Marcus didn't know, what I could only start piecing together over the next several hours, was that fate, or something very close to it, had already arranged the rest of this day for us. 20 minutes after we pulled back onto the interstate, my phone rang through the truck speakers. It was Denise, my dispatcher, and her voice had that particular edge it gets when a routine job suddenly stops being routine. She told me the delivery window had moved. Not later, earlier. The research facility wanted the units on site ahead of schedule because of, in her exact words, increased visibility at a related event that evening. I asked her what that meant. She told me the regional oversight director for the Federal Research Initiative, a man named Whitfield, whose name I only knew from paperwork up to that point, would personally be observing the delivery, because he was already scheduled to be in town that same night for a separate public event. A ribbon cutting. For a new commercial development downtown. I sat with that information for a long moment, watching rain begin to streak the windshield, watching Marcus glance over at me with something like curiosity finally cutting through the shame still sitting heavy on his face from that parking lot. "Dad," he asked slowly, "what exactly are we hauling?" And for the first time since that gas station I let myself smile. Just slightly. Just enough. "Son," I told him, "I can't tell you everything yet, but I need you to trust me on something. In a few hours you're going to watch a man who called us nothing find out exactly what we've been carrying this whole time. And when that happens I need you to remember, what happens tonight isn't about revenge. It's about the truth finally catching up to a man who's spent his entire life running from it." He didn't say anything. But he sat up a little straighter in that seat, and outside the windshield, the storm clouds kept building dark and heavy over the mountain pass we still had to cross. The kind of sky that makes an old trucker's gut tighten on instinct, because I already knew, somewhere underneath the certainty, that whatever came next wasn't going to be just weather. The mountain pass hit us harder than the forecast had promised. I want you to understand what it actually means to drive a rig like mine hauling cargo like that, through conditions like the ones that opened up on us right around mile marker 81. Rain doesn't just fall in those switchbacks, it becomes something closer to an opponent, turning the asphalt into something closer to glass, turning 40,000 pounds of steel and specialized freight into something that wants, with every gust of crosswind, to slide sideways into a guardrail and take everything behind it straight down the mountainside. About 20 minutes into that climb, we hit the moment I still think about more than almost any other part of that day. A stretch of road cresting a blind curve, visibility down to maybe 30 feet through the sheeting rain, and directly ahead of us, stalled dead in the right lane with its hazards barely visible through the downpour, sat a small sedan that had clearly hydroplaned into the shoulder rail and stopped there, driver's door open, nobody visible outside the vehicle. I had less than 4 seconds to make a decision that most drivers never have to make in their entire careers. Brake hard on a slick mountain grade with an irreplaceable, uninsurable federal payload behind me, or hold the throttle steady and thread a gap between the stalled car and the guardrail that I wasn't entirely certain my trailer width would actually clear. I chose the gap. I want to be honest with you about how that decision felt because it wasn't calm, and it wasn't brave in the way movies make bravery look. It was 26 years of muscle memory overriding a screaming, panicked voice in the back of my own skull that was absolutely certain we were about to lose the trailer off the mountainside. My hands found the exact pressure the wheel needed. My foot found the exact rhythm the brakes needed, easing instead of stomping. And we threaded that gap with what I would guess was somewhere under 8 inches of clearance on the guardrail side, close enough that Marcus actually gasped out loud beside me, close enough that I heard the mirror housing clip something metal for just half a second before we were through and the curve was opening back up ahead of us into slightly clearer road. Marcus didn't say anything for almost a full minute after that. Then quietly, shaking slightly, he said, "I thought we were going to die." And I told him the truth because he deserved the truth in that moment more than he deserved comfort. So did I for about 2 seconds. But panicking doesn't slow a truck down, son. Only the wheel does that. You learn to let the fear ride shotgun instead of letting it drive. He sat with that for a long time, staring out at the rain, and I could see him turning it over the same way he'd turned over Coretta's sentence at breakfast that morning, filing it away somewhere it would matter later. We came down out of that pass almost 50 minutes later than I would have liked, the storm finally starting to break apart behind us, streaks of late afternoon light beginning to cut through the retreating clouds. And that's when the third call of the day came through. Not Denise this time, but a voice I didn't recognize at all. Clipped. Official. The voice of someone whose entire job is making sure other people follow instructions without asking too many unnecessary questions. He identified himself as an advanced liaison for Director Whitfield's office, and what he told me next made Marcus's head snap toward me so fast I heard his seatbelt lock against the sudden motion. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for Holloway's development, the one I now understood was happening that very evening, had been relocated, moved from the planned interior atrium out to street level, because someone on Holloway's public relations team had decided a live-streamed outdoor event would photograph better for investors watching remotely from out of state. Which meant the intersection my route required me to pass through wasn't just a nearby cross street anymore. It was now sitting directly in front of a podium, 3 local news cameras, roughly 300 folding chairs full of investors and city officials, and Gary Holloway himself, scheduled to be mid-speech at almost the exact minute my rig would be rolling past. I sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something settle into my chest that wasn't nerves at all. It was certainty. The kind of certainty you only get a handful of times across an entire lifetime, when the universe hands you a coincidence so precise it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like something closer to justice finally being scheduled. We rolled into town just as the storm finally broke apart completely, that strange golden light settling over everything the way it always does after heavy rain, making the wet streets look almost silver under the streetlights beginning to flicker on. And there it was, exactly as described, Holloway's development rising up out of scaffolding and glass, red carpet laid out across the sidewalk, string lights strung between temporary stanchions, a small crowd gathered under a catering tent, and at the center of it all, Gary Holloway himself, standing at a podium in a suit that probably cost more than my last transmission rebuild. Mid-sentence about legacy and vision and the future of the city, he clearly believed he was single-handedly building. And then he heard us coming. You know that sound a fully loaded rig makes when it's downshifting into a residential intersection, that low mechanical growl building into a hiss as the air brakes finally engage, the whole vehicle seeming to exhale as it slows. Every head under that catering tent turned at once, and Gary Holloway, mid-sentence, looked up from his notes and saw exactly what he had mocked nearly 10 hours earlier rolling directly toward his podium, this time flanked by 2 black federal SUVs, lights flashing, escorting us in like we were the single most important thing on that entire street. Because, as it turned out, we were. Director Whitfield stepped out of the lead vehicle before it had even fully stopped, walked straight past Gary Holloway without so much as a glance in his direction, and came directly to my window. Before he said a single word to the crowd, he leaned in and said something quietly, just for me and Marcus to hear. I read the incident flag from your onboard sensors about 40 minutes ago. Some kind of near collision on the pass. You want to tell me what happened up there? I gave him the short version and I watched something shift in his expression. Respect, the real kind, not performance. Most drivers on our approved list would have braked and lost the load off that grade, he said. You made a call most men spend their entire careers hoping they never have to make. Then he straightened up, turned toward the crowd, and raised his voice to carry across the entire street. You made incredible time through that pass, he said, loud enough for the cameras now swinging our direction to catch every word. Command was seriously concerned about containment integrity in that storm system. You just saved this facility 8 months of potential rebuild time and several $1 million in equipment. Half the carriers on our approved list refused this run outright the moment they saw the weather forecast this morning. You didn't just accept it. You got it here early. I climbed down out of that cab slow and deliberate, feeling every one of those 2 million miles settle into my knees all at once, and I felt Marcus climb down right behind me, standing taller in that moment than I had seen him stand in years. Whitfield gestured toward the tarp trailer behind us, addressing the stunned crowd directly, cameras rolling, phones raised. Ladies and gentlemen, what's secured on this trailer represents 9 years of joint research and an estimated $40 million in prototype equipment. This driver just moved it through a mountain storm that most commercial carriers in this state wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, including a near collision on the grade that would have ended most careers permanently if it had gone even slightly differently. If you want to understand what real value looks like in this economy, in this year, you are looking directly at it. I watched Gary Holloway's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. The color drained out of it in real time, right there under the string lights, right there in front of the cameras he himself had personally invited to document his own evening. Because in one unscripted sentence, spoken by a federal director in front of every investor and reporter, Gary had spent his entire career trying to impress. The man who had mocked my son's father in a gas station parking lot 10 hours earlier had just been told, publicly on camera, that the nobody was the single most valuable person standing on that street. Nobody laughed with Gary that time. A few people actually laughed at him, quiet, uncomfortable laughter, the kind that follows a man around for years after a moment like that, replayed at dinner parties long after the ribbon has been cut and the string lights have been packed away into some storage unit nobody thinks about again. Gary tried, to his limited credit, to recover the moment. He stepped toward the microphone, forced a laugh, and said something about how we all serve our part in this economy, clearly trying to fold the humiliation into some kind of gracious, magnanimous statement he could still walk away looking decent from. But Whitfield wasn't finished, and I don't think he'd planned to be. With respect, Whitfield said, still facing the crowd, I overheard part of an exchange at a gas station about 10 hours ago, on my way into town. I'd encourage you to think carefully about the kind of comments you make about people whose actual jobs you don't understand, before you make them in front of witnesses. Some of us take notes. I hadn't even known Whitfield had been anywhere near that gas station. I found out later from Denise that one of his own advanced staff had been in that same parking lot that morning, scouting locations ahead of the event, and had reported the entire exchange back to him almost immediately, including a description of the truck and the driver, never once imagining the two situations would collide 6 hours later in front of 300 people. I didn't say a single word to Gary Holloway. I didn't need to. I turned to Marcus instead, right there in front of everyone, and I finally said the thing I should have said 10 hours earlier in that gas station parking lot. You asked me if we'd ever be more than this. Son, look around you. We already were. He just couldn't see it, because men like him only know how to measure worth by what shines under a streetlight. He's never once had to learn what it takes to keep something delicate, something irreplaceable, alive and moving through a storm nobody else was willing to drive through. Marcus didn't say anything back. He didn't need to. He just looked at that trailer, then at the crowd, then at Gary Holloway standing frozen and pale behind his own podium, and I watched something settle permanently into his posture. Not arrogance, nothing like what Gary carried around with him, but a quiet, unshakable certainty about exactly who his father was. I want to tell you what happened after, because the ceremony ending isn't actually where this story ends for me. We finished the delivery that night. The actual handoff took another 40 minutes at the secure facility, paperwork, signatures. The units finally settled into permanent climate-controlled storage where they belonged. Marcus stood beside me through all of it, quiet, watching the process with a kind of attention I'd never seen from him before, asking small questions here and there that I could actually answer now that the delivery was complete and the confidentiality window had technically closed. We didn't get home until almost 2 in the morning. Marcus fell asleep somewhere around the halfway point, head against the window, and I remember glancing over at him at a red light and feeling something in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. Pride, relief, exhaustion, grief for all the years before that night when I hadn't found a way to give him this feeling sooner. 3 days later, Marcus asked if he could come with me on my next run. Then the one after that. By the end of that summer, he'd started asking real questions about commercial licensing, about the training pathway, about how old you had to be to start the process. I didn't push him toward it. I never have, not once, because I never wanted him choosing this life to prove something to a man in a Tesla, or to me, or to anyone else standing in a parking lot somewhere. I wanted him to choose it, if he ever did, because he'd finally seen what it actually was up close. Not a fallback, not a failure, but a genuine, difficult, respected skill that the entire modern economy still depends on, whether it wants to admit that dependence out loud or not. Gary Holloway, for what it's worth, never said a word to either of us again. I heard through people in town that the video from that ribbon cutting circulated fairly widely for about a week afterward. Not because anyone was trying to destroy him, but because the moment itself was simply too striking not to share. A wealthy developer mid-speech about legacy and vision, publicly corrected by a federal official in front of his own investors, over comments he'd made to a truck driver hours earlier. I never went looking for that video myself. I didn't need to relive it. I'd already lived it once, standing right there in the middle of it, and once was enough. Here's what I want you to take from this story, because it's the only part that truly matters. Once the trucks are unloaded, the cameras go home, and the string lights get packed away for whatever event comes next. Gary Holloway wasn't wrong that night in the parking lot because he was cruel. Plenty of cruel people occasionally happen to be right about something, and cruelty alone has never been enough to make someone wrong. He was wrong because he measured a man's entire worth by the surface of things. The paint job on a truck, the stitching on a jacket, the brand name on a charging cable. He never once asked what was inside, what a person actually carried, what they'd spent a lifetime training themselves to be trusted with, what they were capable of moving through a storm when everyone else had already said no. That is the mistake so many of us make about each other, every single day, without even realizing we're doing it in the moment. We size people up by their parking spot instead of their capacity. We measure them by what they're wearing instead of what they're actually carrying. But the truth, the real and lasting truth underneath all of it, is that the world doesn't actually run on the people who look impressive standing perfectly still under good lighting. It runs on the people who show up when the roads are bad, when the stakes are real, when everyone else who was asked has already said no. Specialized hands. Earned trust. Built 1 mile at a time over decades nobody was watching or applauding. Quiet expertise that never needed a shiny car or a $500 jacket to prove itself to a room full of strangers. In this economy, in this exact year, with machines and algorithms quietly replacing entire categories of work that used to belong to people, that kind of hands-on irreplaceable expertise isn't some consolation prize handed to the people who couldn't make it into a corner office. It is the actual currency that keeps everything else running underneath the surface. Every glass tower, every live-streamed ribbon cutting, every investor deck full of confident promises about the future still depends, in the end, on someone who knows how to move what cannot be replaced, through conditions most people would never willingly risk. So if you've ever been the person standing in that parking lot, the one being looked at like you're nothing because of what you drive or what you wear, or what job title happens to sit under your name on some form somewhere, I want you to carry this with you long after this story ends. Somewhere in your own life, there is cargo that the Gary Holloways of the world simply cannot see. Something you've built quietly with your own 2 hands, over years nobody was applauding you for. Some skill you mastered in silence on nobody's timeline but your own, through storms nobody else even knew you were driving through. Don't waste your breath explaining it to men who only know how to measure shine under streetlights. Just keep driving. Let the storm itself prove what you're actually made of. Because sooner or later, the truth always catches up to people like Gary Holloway. And when it finally does, you won't need to say a single word in your own defense. The work will have already spoken for you, louder and more permanently than any argument ever could.